everybody, thank you so much for coming along to this evening's session. So my name is Tamsin Fretwell, and I work for Magnificent Meadows Cymru project for Plantlife, and I work across North Wales, and I used to work with Clare Flynn, who is going to be doing the one more person arriving, who's going to be doing the talk tonight. I thought I'd just tell you a tiny bit about our project before moving over to Clare. So hopefully I can make this slide move. Oh my goodness. So the Magnificent Meadows project is a 3-and-a-bit-year project that finishes next year. It's a Welsh Government funded project, so thank you to the government for funding this project. And there's lots and lots of other partners, as you can see from the slide. It's Wales wide, and it's called Magnificent Meadows, but it's actually about grasslands. Meadows is just more catchy, so that's how come it's called Magnificent Meadows. So it's all about promoting meadows, helping people restore meadows, encouraging all sorts of people to have meadows on their land. Whoops, I don't know what happened to my slide, it's just disappeared. Oh, come back. Yeah, so I've been working with hospitals and schools and landowners of all sorts, starting meadows groups, community meadows, lots and lots of meadow related activities across North Wales, and my colleague in South Wales, Cassie, has been doing the same. So part of the project is to work with Bumblebee Conservation Trust, hence doing this introduction to bumblebees with Clare Flynn, who used to be the officer for South Wales and has now moved over to Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So yeah, I'll pass over to Clare.
Okay, thank you, Tamsin, thank you. So if you unshare your screen and I'll share mine. Always nerve-wracking bit of technology. Is that okay, Tamsin?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okie doke. So yeah, so that slide and all of that Tamsin just said is really familiar, because I had a fantastic 18 months working with Tamsin on the Mag Meadows project, and I share her enthusiasm and passion for grassland restoration and conservation. But my particular focus is bumblebees and solitary bees as well, to a certain extent. So I've now moved to very kind of from a habitat role to very much a very niche species group role with Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And my project is actually called Skills for Bees Cymru. And I am working as a lone person, and not in the nice team as I was with Plantlife, but it's just me delivering this project, and I cover the whole of Wales. And the whole rationale for my project is to improve our understanding of bumblebee populations across Wales. We lack data both of particular species. We have great big gaps in our data and our understanding, but we also have big geographical gaps in understanding where bumblebees occur within Wales and how particular species are doing. So my project was devised to address those gaps, and it's mainly by training volunteers, training keen people in species level identification, and also in recording bumblebees and monitoring bumblebees. So what I'm going to give you tonight is really, I do lots of training courses, bumblebee ID training, which can be quite intensive, because we're very keen on people really developing their skills and submitting very good quality data. we're completely inclusive, you know, anyone can do this and be part of the project, but we do try and really help people to develop their skills to quite a good level. And what I'm going to provide today is literally a snapshot of an introduction and an ID course. Usually it takes about 2 hours, so we've got about half of that. And also we'll just have a little think within the context of Meadows, how we can manage grasslands for pollinators and bumblebees in particular. Okay, so yeah, and you know, I'll really try and leave some time at the end for some questions as well. So we'll go into bumblebee background, and I'm assuming no knowledge, so I really apologise if you have got bumblebee knowledge. If you can just bear with me, please. In the UK, we have around about 275 species of bee. So it's quite rich, and it varies a little bit, because some years we might have a few less species, or we might find a new species with our recorders out and about in the countryside. So that's an approximate number. And of those, only one species is a honeybee. As you can imagine, often when I give talks to a wide audience, a lot of people don't realise that most bees don't actually make honey. Only Apis mellifera, which is a domesticated insect in the UK. It's a social insect living in a colony with a queen and her workers. You see there, it's largely domesticated. We do have some feral colonies, but ecologically we consider it a domesticated insect. Honeybees die when they sting, so that old myth about do all bees die when they sting, it's actually only honeybees that do, because their sting is barbed. So when they sting you, as they pull away, it damages their insides so much that they often die, because the sting gets stuck in your skin. They have pollen baskets, so they have on their hind legs, they have what we call a corbicula, which is a modified hind leg here where the cursor is. And you can see this honeybee, she's just starting building up her pollen load there, that little white blob. Okay, so that's quite a sort of highly adapted feature of honeybees. And honeybees are able to survive our temperate winter because they make honey. So it's you know, it's an adaptive feature to survive in our climate, which we make use of. So solitary bees make up by far the largest proportion of our bee fauna in the UK and indeed across the world. There's about 25,000 bee species in the whole of the world. So we only have obviously a fraction of that, but most of them are solitary bees. And as their name suggests, they're not social insects, so they don't live in a colony with a queen and her female workers. There's no differentiation, and females, they're basically the ultimate amazing single mums, because they work alone to build their nest, feed their young, they do everything, and they don't do it with the help of workers, they just do it alone. They're wild in the UK, so the species we've got are wild and native. They have a smooth sting, in many cases too small to puncture our skin, but like all bees, all the females have stings and none of the males do. Okay, male bees of any type can't sting, they don't have the equipment. Solitary bees don't have pollen baskets, so they don't have the corbicula on their hind legs. And generally they survive the winter by remaining in the nest as cocoons effectively. So the adults all die and just the young pupae remain, and they emerge as adults the following year. Okay, I'm rushing over these a little bit because this is our focus for this evening and the focus for the organisation that I work for. So bumblebees are perhaps the most familiar. This is what most people think of as bees, the big fuzzy black and yellow ones. And we have 24 species in the UK at the moment. don't worry too much about the 18 social species. We have 18 social species and 6 that we call cuckoo bumblebees, but it's 24 in total. They're mostly wild, though we do actually import factory bred colonies, which is a bit of a shame, to work in greenhouses, because bumblebees are such incredible pollinators. And there are some crops such as tomatoes, blueberries, kiwi fruits that only bumblebees can pollinate effectively. So we do actually import colonies from a big factory in the Netherlands. Like honeybees, they have pollen baskets or corbicula. And if you look at this queen on the top left here, you can see her hind leg. The surface of it is very smooth and shiny, and that's where she builds up her pollen load. So highly specialised hind legs. And bumblebees survive the winter by the queens hibernating, which I'll come on to in a bit of detail in a sec. So they survive our temperate winter, not by honey, but by hibernation. So again, slightly different ecology to the other 2 groups of bees. So we're going to focus just on the bumbles now. And as I said just now, we have 24 species in the UK. 18 of these are true social bumblebees. And this is actually a nest. My friend makes things, she makes felt. She does needle felting. And this was an organic sheep's fleece that she had in her shed. And you can see the bumblebees have made a nest there. And that big one there, you can just see the behind, that's the queen. And then her daughter workers are helping her. So they're true social bumblebees, truly social insects. But we have 6 species in the UK that have adapted to different life strategy, and we call those the cuckoos. And they actually behave exactly like a cuckoo bird. So the female invades the nest of a social bumblebee, and she kills the queen, and she lays her eggs in the nest, and she uses the workers of the host queen to bring up her young. Okay, so we call those the cuckoo bumblebees. And I'm not going to go into those in any more detail, but when I do the ID courses for my project, we do look at those as a group, because they're quite amazing actually in how they've evolved. So on Saturday, when we're doing our little bee foray at Priory Saltings in Haverfordwest, we will no doubt see some bee mimics, such as these hoverflies. And we have lots of bee mimics in the UK. And some of them, for example, like this one here, this hoverfly, Volucella bombilans, they are incredible. You know, evolution is an amazing thing, and this mimics the whitetail bumblebee perfectly. And it does that because bees have a sting, so birds and other predators quickly learn to avoid them. Hoverflies don't have a sting, but if they mimic the bee, they've got less chance of being eaten. So when we're learning to identify bees, this is a group. We do look a little bit at the hoverflies as well, because lots of people in the field get confused by these two. And the way we usually tell them apart is by the shape of their heads. So on the left there is a bumblebee with long antennae, and their eyes very much on the sides of their heads. But the hoverflies much shorter antennae and these great big compound eyes which cover their heads. So when we're in the field on Saturday, when we're catching things, we'll be looking for these anatomical difference between the bumblebees and their mimics. And I've been fooled loads of times, really easy to do. So bumblebees, why are they such a thing? There seems to have been loads of interest in pollinators the last few years. And bumblebees in particular, like I said, are particularly fantastic pollinators. Tomatoes, they buzz pollinate. So I can hear my son playing his violin really badly. I hope you can't. Tamsin, can you let me know if that's distracting, and I'll go and tell him to be quiet?
I can't hear.
Okay, I hope he doesn't get any louder as he can't really play it. So bumblebees buzz pollinate crops such as tomatoes, where they vibrate to knock the pollen off the answers. And no other bees in the UK can do that effectively. So they have a huge commercial value, like millions and millions of pounds, both in Europe and in the wider world. So because of that, the fact they've been in decline has garnered a lot more attention from governments and researchers and universities than a lot of other taxonomic groups, because they have this huge economic value. And if we lost our pollinators, and in this case our bumblebees, the cost to replace that service would be immense. Could we be employing people with paintbrushes to move pollen from one plant to another? So yeah, they've garnered a lot of attention in recent years. And you know, Tamsin obviously works on the Meadows project, and I'm sure you know, like lots of other groups, bumblebees and so much of our wildlife has suffered massive declines, so basically since the end of the Second World War and our changes in land use. And effectively it's habitat loss that has decimated bumblebee numbers. So you hear about pesticides and chemicals, which are an issue. You hear about diseases, which can be an issue, but really it's habitat loss that have caused our catastrophic declines. And the next change is climate. And we're only just beginning to work out what's going to happen or what may happen with that. So the changes, I mean, this is a cereal field, but I know where I live in Pembrokeshire, you know, I'm surrounded by silage, perennial ryegrass, just uniform landscape, and there is no food. There is no food for bees. There's no pollen and nectar, which is why meadow restoration, meadow creation is just so important for these species. So I've just got a couple of very simple slides here while we're on the subject of meadows, because we're doing this talk through the Meadows project. If you are a landowner, or for example, I know Christopher there helps to manage a community meadow in Haverfordwest. If you are involved in anything like that, or even in your garden, you know, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that leaving some flowers, mowing less, makes a difference. We cannot change wider agriculture at the moment on a big scale, though I think changes are coming, things are improving, but we can make a difference. And these insects can fly, so they can fly from patch to patch, they can fly from garden to garden. All these photographs are mine, by the way, taken over the last year or so. If you have got a bit of land that you can manage to improve for pollinators and specific bumblebees, leaving your yellow composites, so all the dandelion type flowers like the hawkweeds, the hawkbits, the cat's ears, they are phenomenally good pollen and nectar sources for a whole variety of pollinators, bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies and other insect pollinators as well. Things for bumblebees, some of the most important flowers are the pea flowers, the legumes. So things like red clover, white clover, bird's foot trefoil. This is a picture I took on the weekend. This is a meadow in Pembrokeshire, and the purple is tufted vetch. So the vetches, they are all really good for bumblebees in particular, because bumblebees have relatively long tongues and they're really attracted to the deep pea type flowers like bird's foot trefoil and vetches. So all of those sorts of things, the yellow composite, the legumes, are all really, really good for bumblebees specifically. Okay. And this is just a simple slide. I won't dwell on this because this is about meadows, but you know what we're looking for are perennial meadows. So we're not looking for the sort of picture, what do they call them, pictorial meadows with poppies and annuals. What we need is perennial flowers, really. We need perennial meadows. So this meadow here is full of knapweed, which is an absolutely fantastic late forage plant for bumblebees. And I'll come to why that is in a minute. So perennial meadows, not overgrazed, but also the second picture here, where you've got grassland that isn't managed, often goes quite rank, and you get a dominance of grasses and you lose your flowers. So you do need that cutting and wherever possible grazing as well, which I know Tamsin has got. There's lots more information about that on the Mag Meadows website. So this is kind of what we're aiming for. And just very simply, for management for pollinators, we're always advised to cut meadows in late summer, so you're mimicking a hay cut. But for pollinators, do it as late as you can. If you don't need to make hay from it, leaving it even till September or October rather than July and August is brilliant, because things like knapweed can flower really late. And also, if you're managing a grassland for pollinators, you can cut it late in the spring as well. So I've seen a meadow cut as late as the end of May, and then you get a flush in the late summer of bird's foot trefoil, knapweed, self-heal, clovers, and they'll go much later into the summer. So if you're not worried about making hay, making it all a bit later is brilliant for pollinators and bumblebees. Okay, so a few little tips there, and I'll explain why that late forage is good in a sec. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to briefly give you the bumblebee annual life cycle. So a little bit of nitty gritty on bumblebees now. So the queen there, that is a queen, emerges in the spring. If you remember, I said she hibernates. So queen bumblebees emerge in the spring, and they've mated the season before. And she holds the sperm inside herself. So the male has died. He's done his bit. He's long dead. She doesn't need him anymore, but she keeps the sperm and she can use it when she chooses. Okay, very matriarchal society with bumblebees. And when she's ready, she fertilizes her first batch of eggs. And within her nest, so she gets a nest site, which I can tell you a bit more about in a sec. She finds a nest site and she lays her first batch of eggs into a little ball of pollen and nectar. And she broods it just like a bird. She sits on that nest and she makes herself a little wax cup out of wax secreted from her body, and she fills it with nectar. And she uses that to sustain herself while she's sitting on her eggs. And I find that amazing. You know, she's an insect and she is capable of doing all of that, which I just think is incredible. And during that time, she'll go out and she'll forage for nectar to keep herself going. So spring nectar and pollen sources are really important for queen bumblebees. You can see at the beginning there, they've depicted willow, which is a really, really important early source of food. And what happens within the nest is her first batch of eggs hatch and they turn into female workers. So all of her daughters become workers to help her, not like my daughter, I should add. And they take over the job of collecting pollen and nectar, and the queen stays in the nest, and more wax cells are made, and she actually begins to lay eggs into these cells, and the worker bees, her daughters, feed them. They feed them a pollen and nectar mix. And this is what distinguishes bees from wasps, is that they feed their young solely pollen, whereas wasps feed their young other insects. So bees evolved from wasps, and they're effectively like vegetarian wasps, if you like. So the nest grows, the number of workers increases through the summer, and that's why we see more and more bumblebees through the summer. And then towards the end of the season, the queen will make changes which results in her laying eggs, which turn into males and new queens. And the males and the new queens leave the nest and they go off to mate with males and new queens from other nests. Okay, so that's right at the end of the nest cycle, and in most cases towards the end of the summer. About now, we see males and new queens. And the new queen, once she's mated, she'll only mate once, she'll go off, feed up, find a hibernation spot. The males will die, the old queens will die, all the workers will die, and the only ones to survive are the new queens. Having mated, they hibernate, oh, wrong way, to start again. So that's the bumblebee life cycle, and that is why we need forage throughout the year. We need spring forage for the queens coming out in March and April. We need forage for the workers and the grubs all through the spring and summer. And then we need nectar for the males at the end of the summer. And that's why late flowering plants and leaving your grasslands as late as you can is really important for bumblebees. And a lot of the species that we've lost that are in decline are the ones that have the latest colony cycles, because by the end of the summer now in the landscape, there's just nothing for them to eat. Okay, so there's a queen. And very quickly, I'm going to whiz through this. So they emerge from hibernation in spring. And you see new queens at the end of the summer again, the new generation. They're generally pretty big compared to the workers and the males. They have pollen baskets. They tend to be nice and bright. And in the spring, I'm sure some of you have seen those big bumblebees. They sort of zigzag over the ground in the early spring, and they're looking for nest sites. Okay. They're brilliant. They really are brilliant. The workers, they tend to be small versions of their mothers in most species. They are the bumbles that give bumblebees their busy kind of appearance, because they're just always collecting nectar, drinking pollen, tending the nest, busy, busy, busy. And they too have pollen baskets on their hind legs. And towards their end of the life, they often look completely faded and ragged and worn out, because they do wear themselves out. The males, in contrast, we see them, at the end of the summer. They're generally rather lazy. They basically leave the nest and go and find some nectar sources, sit around in groups drinking nectar, move fairly slowly. I know it's all familiar, it's all familiar. They don't have any pollen baskets because they never collect any pollen. They never feed the young. They're often more fluffy. They often have a lot more facial hair, which in many males is bright yellow, like you can see here. They have longer antennae, and they may fade quite quickly because they're out in the sun, because they never go back to the nest. But generally, they don't do a lot, okay? They drink nectar and wait for a queen to pass by. So, but they're often very pretty. So, oh, come on, slides. There we go. Right, I'm going to whiz through some ID because I'm really conscious how long I talk for. So basic bumblebee anatomy, they are insects. So they have a typical insect structure with 3 bits: a head, a thorax, which is the middle bit, it's the middle bit, and an abdomen, which is the back half of the bee, as you'd imagine. So the sting is there at the bottom. at the tip of the tail, and only females have a sting, so males can't even do that. Okay, they can't even sting to defend the nest. They're completely harmless. And underneath all that gorgeous fuzzy hair, bumblebees are completely black, all of them. So once they lose their hair, which they sometimes do by the end of the summer, it's almost impossible to tell them apart. Okay, we've done that, so I'm going to move on from that one. Okay, so a quick sort of intro to bumblebee ID for the most common 8 species. When it's actually quite a difficult thing and it needs lots of practice, but this is just to give you a taste of our common 8. And when we are identifying bumblebees, we look at a whole set of clues. So we look at tail colour, we look at banding. Excuse me, in this case, there is no banding, but the yellow bands. We look at facial hair, like I mentioned, with the males, it can be yellow. We look at their legs, what shape they are, and if they have pollen baskets, because that helps us to tell the sex, because the males don't have pollen baskets. We look at the length of their antennae, and we look at their behaviour. So, for example, if you see a bumblebee in April, it's almost impossible that it's going to be a male, because the males don't come out till later in the summer. So that gives us a clue as well. And these are our 8 most common species. Now in the UK, if you remember, I told you we have 24 species. They've all declined in the last 70 years, apart from, well, debate is out on these 8. These 8 species out of 24 have remained relatively common and widespread. All of the others have shown massive declines. So the picture is dire, really. And the reason these 8 have managed to survive quite well is they've adapted to garden habitats and urban habitats better. So they've survived better. Our other bumblebees are struggling. So this is a bit of a baptism of fire in such a short time. But in the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, we teach people to identify bumblebees. And the first thing we teach people is to look at tail colour. So on the left, we have 4 species that we say have white tails. The buff-tail bumblebee, which is the most common one, actually, the queen has a slightly buff tail, creamy. But we classify these 4 as having white tails. There's 2 common ones that have a red tail, the early bumblebee and the red-tailed bumblebee. And then we have 2 gingery bumblebees that are common, the tree bumblebee, which also has a white tail, so it is slightly confusing, and the common carder bee, which is generally all ginger. So we have the buff and the white tail over here on the left. And all we're going to look at today is the females, because the males are quite difficult. And the females have white or buff bottoms and 2 yellow stripes. And then we have 2 species that have white bottoms and 3 yellow stripes, the garden bumblebee and the Heath Bumblebee. And then for the others, as I've said, the red tail is the early bumblebee and the red-tailed bumblebee. And then the 2 gingery ones. So we're going to have a quick, like I say, baptism of fire. Now I can send this sheet to everyone who attended Tamsin by email afterwards, because this is freely available on our website and it's a really nice summary. So Tamsin, could you remind me to send that to you, and then you can send it out to everyone after the talk?
Okay, yeah, so if anybody hasn't given me their email address, email me with your address.
Yeah, or pop it in the chat, I suppose, but yeah, that would be great, and we can get those out to you. Yeah, so there they are in picture form. There are common 8. So we've got, these are all the queens. The queens are the easiest to learn to identify. And like I said, I usually spend a good 2 hours on this, so do bear with me. But there's the buff-tail queen. So she has a buff-coloured bottom and two lovely deep yellow stripes. They're almost marmalade-y, sort of deep yellowy orange. Those are the ones that you see in the spring, those gigantic ones that buzz past you on an April or a March day. The buff-tail queens are really common in gardens and parks and that sort of environment. And then the white-tail queens are very, very similar, but they have pure white bottoms. Not quite so widespread as the buff-tail. Don't see them quite so often. And then the red-tail bumblebee here is really common in gardens and places like community meadows and parks. They love meadow habitats, red tails, and I'm sure you've seen them. They're so beautiful, and the females, the queens and the workers, just have this beautiful red bottom and all black, velvety black. So that's a red-tail bumblebee, really easy to remember. The early bumblebee is also really common in gardens, occurs everywhere. Bit harder to remember this one because it has this little tiny sort of, well, I call it peachy bottom, just a little peach colour there at the end, and the queens have two yellow stripes. A little bit harder to get to grips with, and they can look a bit like the buff tails. And then the garden bumblebee down here on the bottom left. This has the three yellow stripes, so two in the middle like that form a belt, and one behind its head. And these, as the name suggests, are really common in gardens, and they have the longest face of any British bumblebee. So when you get your identification sheet off, Tamsin and I, that they've got real horsey faces, real long faces. And then the Heath Bumblebee looks very similar, but it has a very round face. And if you would live in Wales near any uplands, if you go up and look at the heather, this is often the bumblebee you'll see, hence its name, the Heath Bumblebee. And finally, we have the two common ginger bumblebees, the common carder, which is ginger all over, but with a little bit of black on its abdomen, and the tree bumblebee. If any of you have had bumblebees nesting in bird boxes or under the eaves of your roof or in your shed, it's almost certainly the tree bumblebee with a gingery thorax and a white tail with a bit of black in the middle. And the tree bumblebee only came into Britain in 2001. It's only been here for 20 years, natural colonisation from continental Europe, and it's probably due to climate change. And now they're everywhere. They're so common. So that's kind of a good news story. That's a bumblebee that's increasing, not decreasing. And what I've got here, how are we doing for time, Tamsin? Because I can't see it on my screen.
It's 7:11.
Okay, so I'm going to, if you're up for it, I'm going to quickly go through a little bit more detail on the ID of each of those species. So that gives you a little bit of background before we stop for some questions. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So there's the buff tails, the common ones you see in the spring with their buff bottom and their stripes, their two stripes. I'm not going to dwell on these slides, folks, but the queens, workers and males all look alike in the buff tail. And that is a bee that you will all have seen. Okay, I'm going to whiz past some of that detail. So the white-tailed bumblebee is similar, but snowy white tail, not the buff bottom like the buff tail. And the workers look just like their mums, but the males are one of the males with a yellow moustache. Okay, so a white-tailed male has a lot of yellow on it. It's one of the most yellowy bumblebees, actually, with his yellow facial hair. Okay, the garden bumblebee is the one with a horsey face. So that'll be on your sheet, very, very distinctive, and I can almost guarantee you'll have it in your gardens. Very common species, very striking, and it has the longest tongue of any British bumblebee. And the males, there's the long face. And the males, the queens and the workers, they all look the same, and they love the deepest flowers. They love foxgloves, they love monkshood, because their tongues are so long that they can get to the deepest nectar. Okay. So the Heath Bumblebee is very similar to the garden bumblebee, but it doesn't have the long face. It has a little round face, and it likes heather. So a bit habitat specific, that one. Very much a bumblebee of the uplands and coastal heath, things like that. Very, it's my favourite species. It's really fluffy and very pretty. And I love when you do look at heather, and when you do find this species, it's quite nice. So that's the Heath Bumblebee, white bottom and 3 yellow stripes. Okay, tree bumblebee, common as muck in gardens. Like I said, this is the one that came in 2001. No other bumblebee looks like the tree bumblebee in the UK. It is very, very distinctive, with a gingery, foxy thorax, and then black, and it always has a white tail and loves nesting in bird boxes. And they will fight the birds. They will fight the blue tits and the sparrows to get them out of the box. They're really feisty. The queens, workers and males all look the same, but when I'm doing a proper ID course, I do mention that you can get these tree bumblebees that are all black by a genetic quirk, which confuses people. So you do sometimes see all black bumblebees with a white tail, which is a little mutation in the tree bumblebee. And this one, again, you will have seen the common carder. It's our only common ginger bumblebee. And it looks a little bit like the tree bumblebee, but it never has a white tail. So we call this one of our ginger carders. And they're really common, and they last right into September and October. So the common carder, if you see a gingery bumblebee and it doesn't have a white tail, it'll almost certainly be a common carder. Very, widespread in gardens, meadows, everywhere. Very successful species. But in contrast, most of our rare bumblebees are very closely related to this. The other carder bees are almost all rare. And the early bumblebee, that's the one I said is a bit more tricky than the others, with a little red tail and always yellow stripes. So queens, workers and males. And the male early bumblebee, this is one I saw up on Preseli a few years ago, and I just think that's the most beautiful bumblebee. It's such a fluffy species, and the males are like little yellow teddy bears. They're absolutely beautiful in the male, in the early bumblebee. And you can see that yellow facial hair. Okay, not in the queen, never in the worker, but the males always have that beautiful yellow face in the early bumblebee. So I know this is loads to take in such a short space of time. And last but not least, the beautiful red tail. And the queens and the workers, the females, are super distinctive, and I'm sure some of you will have seen these. But again, the males have a little yellow collar and a little yellow moustache. So they're distinctive from the females of the same species, but it's the females that, you know, for beginners, that I would say to start looking out for because they're much easier to identify. And they do fade. They all fade in the sun, bumblebees. They get quite bleached. This is a book that is written by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and it's a brilliant beginner's guide. It's available on Amazon and on the website of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust for a tenner, and I think it's a bargain. It's absolutely brilliant beginner's guide, really, really user friendly, and it's got all 24 species in with lots of lovely photographs. There's also the Field Guide to Bees of Britain and Ireland, but that's a weighty tome, not for the faint-hearted, because it's got all the solitary bees in as well, and it's quite complex scientific keys, so I wouldn't do that unless you're quite confident. And we've got a brilliant beginner's bumblebee app, which is free, called What's That Bumblebee? It's developed by my colleagues, and it's only the 8 common species we've looked at today. So I'd heartily recommend that for your phone, because it's so, so useful. Really lovely and simple app. It's got an augmented reality bee on it. I'd avoid that bit. I don't bother with the augmented reality bee, but the ID pages of the app are just really good. And I'm going to actually stop there. We do ask people to record their bumblebee sightings. If any of you do use iRecord or the Lurk Wales app, please, please, please send us your bumblebee data. And if you're interested in learning more about that, or our citizen science scheme Bee Walk, I am running talks through the winter to explain those recording methods for people who are really keen. But I'm not going to dwell on those now because we've run out of time. Right, okay. I'm not going to do the quiz time now because I've bombarded with you, but I would like to open up the floor to any bumblebee questions at all. And I don't mind if you can put your hand up on the Zoom, on the little hand up thingy, Bob, or you can shout out or put it in the chat. I'm really happy to, if Tamsin, could you look at the chat for me, Tamsin? Are there any questions in the chat? And if anyone wants to holler, please do. You can unmute yourself. Anyone for anything? Are you going to be doing any ID events around Vale of Glamorgan? Yes, I don't know quite how I'm going to do it. I've got quite a few people in the Vale, including some groups that are really keen to do some ID. So I might be doing some online Zooms for those people. Whether I have half got field day planned as well, but I'm actually running out of time. I've got so many requests this summer that I'm not quite sure. So if I can have your email, I should put my email up so that you can contact me actually. Bear with me a sec.
You can just put it in the chat if you want.
Yeah, let me put my email in the chat. That's a good idea. So I want to do it to everyone. Right, here's my email. If you're interested in more at bumblebeeconservation.org, yeah, that's it. If you want to email me about courses and joining my project mailing list, if you can do that via email. But if you've got any actual questions about bumblebees, that's what we can deal with here. So are there any in the chat, Tamsin? Any?
Yes, there was one further back, or I can go back to the beginning. Can we have the where to record sightings info slide again, please?
Yeah. Hang on a minute.
The Lurk app, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I've got to share again. Bear with. Sorry, I scooted over that because, like I said, I'm trying to pack a lot in. But like I said, I am running a whole talk on this in the winter. I'm just about to put the dates out, so showing you how to use the app and all sorts of stuff. And then I just saw something about the tree bumblebee. in the chat. So let me just...
Claire, if people want to record bumblebees, then should they go either onto iRecord or the Lurk app?
Either. So basically, with recording, there's two ways of doing it. You can submit ad hoc sightings. So just like if you're out for a walk and you see a bumblebee, you just want to submit a record. You can do that either through iRecord, which is the UK-wide biodiversity database, and it has its own app, or you can submit it through your local record centre. Depending on where you are in Wales, there are 4 local record centres. Now you can submit it through their websites, or you can submit your record through the Lurk Wales app, which is super easy to use, and it looks like this on the Play Store or on the App Store. Whether you use iRecord or the Lurk Wales app doesn't matter. All the records go to the same place, and they all get verified by the same high-level team of bee experts. So submitting data either through either of those channels is great for us. Or you can set up, which is a bit more of a task, a bee walk monitoring transact, and I am providing training for that across Wales for the next 2.5 years. So if you want more information on that, please get in touch with me. Okay.
And you'll be doing some of those for Plantlife as well, won't you, next summer?
Oh yeah, I'd forgotten that. Yes, I will. Yeah.
So can I just ask about the recording? Are you interested in very common species as well, or is it just unusual ones?
No, definitely the common ones. We've got whole areas of Wales with no bumblebee species records at all. And also at the moment, all our bee walk data for the last 10 years is suggesting that our common species are actually declining. So we desperately need data on all of our species. And the thing is, for most people, you are only ever going to see the common ones. You know, seeing the other species of bumblebees is quite a challenge. You need to be, you know, in the right place, in the right habitat, and you need to know what you're looking for. So really at this level, we're asking people for common species, and it's really important.
Can I just ask, Claire, when people, if you, presumably you can catch them and have a look at them because they're going to be moving around quite quickly. If you're a beginner, is that okay to catch them in a pot and have a look?
Yeah, with my normal training sessions, like I said, which are 2 hours long, I do go through what equipment you need. You can record bumblebees by just looking. So for example, a red tail is really distinctive. There are very rare species that look similar, but by and large, red tails look very, very similar, distinctive. And with a decent phone camera, you can get enough information just from looking and using your camera to start to identify stuff. If you do a bee walk or you want to get into more serious recording, then really you are limited by photographs, and you need to start thinking about catching them and putting them in pots with a net, and using a hand lens to look at not microscopic, but look at detailed features. And it doesn't hurt them. They're pretty tough. As long as you release them quite quickly where you found them, they're fine. They'll go off, they go back to their nest, and they're absolutely fine. But that's something that I do, you know, in depth at sort of a slightly next level, if you like. Yeah, I was actually gonna this evening, I need to make a video on how to catch and pot a bee. That's one of my things on my to-do list, to go on the Bumblebee Conservation Trust YouTube channel. So I don't know if I'll have time now tonight, but it's something I need to do, because it is a bit of an art to it, because you don't want to get stung, obviously. So I wouldn't recommend it unless you're quite confident with using an insect net.
Okay, thanks. There's another question. Can you comment on bumblebees stealing nectar tubular flowers by piercing base of flower, for example, comfrey?
Yeah. So bumblebees, another reason why they're brilliant pollinators, if you imagine all honeybee workers are one species and they have, not that I'm anti-honeybee, but it's just a comparison. They have tongue lengths which are about 6 millimeters long. The 24 bumblebee species we have in the UK have tongue lengths varying between 6 millimeters and 20 millimeters. So the range of flowers that they visit is absolutely huge compared to honeybees. But within that, some species like the bufftail, for example, the really common one, has a much shorter tongue length than the garden bumblebee. So they can't access, bufftails can't access nectar in deep flowers, such as campion, comfrey to a certain extent, honeysuckle, fuchsias, all of those sorts of flowers. So what bufftail bumblebees do is they nibble a hole in the base of the flower where they know the nectaries are, and they basically nick the nectar and they don't pollinate the flower. So it's called nectar robbery. And what happens is once the bufftails, who are the main culprits, nibble the hole, loads of other insects, including honeybees, then come along and use it. So they all learn. And they basically cheat the flower because they don't pollinate it so effectively then. So yeah, that's the thing. And if you walk along a hedgerow looking at campion, sort of in about July, you can often see nibbled holes in nearly every single flower. So that's fun. And I saw somebody ask a question about the tree bumblebee being discussed as an invasive species and discussing it negatively. The truth is, species disperse and migrate, whether it's plants, animals, insects, whatever, humans, all the time. And there's a lot of debate around invasive species at the moment, and what that actually means for our biodiversity. In the case of the tree bumblebee, my boss is one of the leading bumblebee academics in Britain. And all the research has shown so far that it has no negative effect on our native species at all. It's a completely natural colonisation, and these things have happened throughout history. And so, no, from our point of view as bumblebee conservationists, there is no negativity around the tree bumblebee at all, apart from the fact that we get tons and tons of phone calls in May because people don't like their nests in their sheds and their bird boxes. But apart from that, there's a much greater issue with honeybees at the moment. Honeybees are having, all the research is showing at the moment that they're having a negative effect on our native pollinators, because the number of beekeepers and hives have gone up dramatically because people feel that by keeping honeybees, they're helping the bees. And that's a narrative that is seen at a commercial scale. And obviously we're not anti-honeybee, but we are trying to change that message that actually by keeping honeybees, you're not helping native pollinators at all, quite the reverse, because they compete directly with solitary bees and bumblebees for pollen and nectar. So there's a massive issue there. And like a honeybee hive might have 50,000 workers, a bumblebee nest might only have 50 workers. So the amount of honey and pollen and nectar that honeybees gather is absolutely phenomenal compared to the species that are around them in the wider countryside. So there is an issue there. Not that we want people to stop keeping honeybees, but we have, for example, been working with Marks and Spencers recently, who put out a huge campaign that they were saving the bees by adding 30 million hives to their own farms over the coming years, and they thought they were doing a good thing. So it's just a lack of understanding of the interplay between these species at the moment. So yeah, are there any other questions? We've gone over a bit. I'm really happy though to stay a few more minutes if people want to ask any more questions.
There's another one, Claire. We seem to have badgers raiding bumblebee nests. Can you comment?
Yeah, that is quite an issue, and I don't want to be controversial at all here, so I am not commenting on any issues to do with badger culls or anything else, because I don't know anything about it. All I do know that is badgers are one of the main predators on bumblebees. They're one of the few mammals that just aren't affected by the sting, the defence of the bumblebees at all. And where you've got a lot of badgers in an area of countryside, you'll almost certainly have hardly any bumblebee nests because they decimate them. They eat the wax combs, they'll eat the, it's not honey, but like the sugary pollen nectar mix that bumblebees feed to their young, and they'll eat all the grubs. So yeah, badgers, where you've got huge numbers of badgers in a particular area, they will decimate bumblebee populations, but they are natural predators. But it's just when their numbers go up very high, then the bumblebees struggle to have successful colonies. So yeah, it's a known issue. Any more? Maybe time for one more.
Oh, I thought that's a really interesting question from Margaret. Are bumblebees vulnerable to the same virus that is decimating honeybees?
Oh, that is a good question, and I'm not very knowledgeable on this, I must admit. But the there can be transfer of various viruses and mites and parasites from domesticated bees to wild bees, but generally I don't think that some of the stuff that's decimated honeybee hives in recent years isn't so prevalent in bumblebee colonies. You know, they're quite different insects, and their life, their ecology, if you like, is quite different. But the truth is I'm not very knowledgeable on it, so I don't really know. And I know there's quite a lot of research on how some of these things are transferred, but I don't know the detail of how they are. So I can't answer your question very fully in that, and other than I know that they're not as affected in general by the same diseases.
Can I ask, Claire, what about, I've heard people say that 5G can affect them as well. Do you know, or is more research needed on that one?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. I mean, I know they have really, really complex navigational systems in their little tiny bee brains, and they, you know, their sensory perception is very, very different from ours. But I've certainly not heard anything about that in the Conservation Trust, so I wouldn't like to comment on that. Yeah, something I can ask about.
I was surprised. I rescued a bumblebee the other day that was looking unhappy, and gave it some honey, and it perked up. But I was looking at it with the hand lens just out of interest, and it had a couple of mites crawling on it, quite big mites. And
well, there's two issues there, Tamsin, right? Yeah. One is you never give bumblebees honey.
Oh, whoops.
Right, that's really, really bad for them.
Oh no!
For lots of different reasons. And there is a trend at the moment. Bumblebees rest a lot, right? And they've survived for millennia without us giving them sugar water or honey or anything else. Bumblebees often rest. They often need to rest. They're often cold. They might be taking some time out. And there seems to be this massive thing now about giving bumblebees sugar water. We don't recommend it as the Conservation Trust for this group of species, because it's basically like giving them Red Bull. It's like giving a toddler Coke, okay, Coca-Cola. It's not particularly good for them, and it may be 9 times out of 10 you can offer bumblebee sugar water. That's if you're going to give them anything, make it sugar water, not honey, right? It's less dangerous for them. But, you know, bumblebees die all the time as well. Workers only live a few weeks, males only live a few weeks. You know, it's nature, it's what they do. If you see a bumblebee that looks a bit sad, if it hasn't moved after about 45 minutes, because they can rest up to that long, and it's still alive, if you can gently, using an envelope or a credit card or whatever, move it on to a flower, you know, something like lavender or a dandelion, the chances are it'll nectar up naturally and fly off, or it'll just die because it was going to die anyway. So that's advice there. I mean, I'm just absolutely horrified now. You can buy key rings, plastic key rings with sugar water in them. You know, yeah, really, really not good. But the other thing you said, what was the other thing you said? The mite.
The mites.
Yeah, totally natural. Those big mites you see on bumblebees, and sometimes the queens have loads of them. They are just mites that live in the nest and eat all the detritus, all the rubbish in the nest, and they hitch rides. They hitch rides to go from one nest to another, like very often on a queen, so they fall off in the nest and just eat the rubbish in the nest. So don't worry about, you know, I've seen people trying to pick them off with tweezers. Just leave them be. Yeah. I hope that I can see a few people yawning. So I need to shut up about bumblebees. We've gone over, but I'm really glad there's this interest. And do email me if you want to be on my mailing list, and you can learn lots more about bumbles and recording and identification and blah blah, all of that stuff.
And I'll pass you all the emails from the chat.
Okie dokes, yeah, that would be great. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I'm sorry to cut you off if there were more questions, but I realise it is quite late for everybody now.
And if anybody hasn't booked on either Priory Saltings meadow visit or the one in Borth the following week, do get in touch if you'd like to join. There's still spaces. So yeah, my email address was in the chat or is on any of the advertising. Thank you so much, Claire. That was a really, really good talk. It was really interesting. I was thinking, oh my God, it's going to be really scary. There's going to be too much info, but it was ideal.
Brilliant. I'm glad you enjoyed. I was really conscious in that I was, like I say, I rarely do a talk only for an hour, and I was packing so much detail in. So I'm sorry if it was a bit like, oh, crazy bee stuff, but yeah, cool. Thank you everyone for coming.
We expect you to turn up in a bumblebee costume for the weekend.
No. Nice to see everybody. I'll stay on, Tamsin, just have a quick chat with you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much everybody for coming. Bye.
Bye. Christopher, can you stay on a sec? Oh, he's gone. Can you just stay on a sec, please?
Oh.
Okay, great stuff.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, cool. If you can unmute Chris, that'd be great. Can you unmute him, Tamsin?
I can ask to unmute, apparently.
There we go.
No. No, that's all I can do is ask.
Unmute. Okay.
There we are.
Ah,
hooray! Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I do need to be kept quiet sometimes.
I'm only going to stay for a minute because I'm a bit wrecked, but I just